There is a Greek proverb, a society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. What are the greatest examples of this in human history? Joseph Bazalgette was a Victorian engineer who masterminded London's modern sewer system in the 1860s. He foresaw the insane population growth, and when all the calculations were made on how big to bore the pipes underground, he essentially said, "Nah, let's double it." Now, infrastructure that would have been unable to cope in the 1960s is still in use today. Yeah, he also insisted on the use of Portland cement, which was much more durable. That said, it still just dumped the effluent into the river, turning it toxic. Several people died from ingesting the dirty water while trying to escape a sinking ship in the SS Princess Alice accident. But you really appreciate the better sewers when you visit other cities that weren't so lucky to have such a visionary engineer, and you can smell the sewers on the street as they weren't dug as deep. And Dubai was like, actually we can just get slaves from Pakistan and India and make them truck our shit away, and we won't need pipes, or storage tanks, or none of that new-timey bullshit. Nothing works better than an old-fashioned hungry, isolated, contractually obligated slave. That's the entire country, not just Dubai. 90% of their population is foreign, they have almost no domestic manufacturing, and almost all of the fancy projects they keep showing off are designed by foreign engineers and then contracted to slave labor to build. Dubai is essentially just a pop-up city in the middle of nowhere. Dubai is essentially just a pop-up city in the middle of nowhere. I feel like Dubai has no culture. It's all about rich handbags, fancy cars, and towering skylines. It's empty vapidness. Almost like a mirage in the desert. Kind of like Las Vegas. Except the strippers and gambling. No, they still have that too, just make sure you are rich enough. Norway's sovereign wealth fund. That generation could have taken a selfish view and just taken the cash, or politicians just gone on a vote-buying spree. But it's independently invested and managed for the benefit of future generations. Australia in our minds. So much money given to billionaires to keep our jobs. During the Napoleonic Wars, there was a Royal Navy admiral who, when on leave, used to wander his country estate planting oak trees to provide timber for the Navy. It's estimated they are about ready now. Sweden did something similar. And then the Office of Forestry informed the Navy that their oaks are ready now. In 1975. If I remember correctly, the story goes that the warden of the forest that took care of the oaks at Vissings called the royal court to tell the king that the trees are ready. Eventually he was put trough and allowed to talk to the king. The king found it very amusing and invited the warden to the royal palace for dinner and drinks at it. After a quick Google, my story does not seem to be accurate, and the op is correct in that the Marine was informed, not the king. However, as I was told the king's story on a school trip to Gurna, Great Polka Candy, and Vissings, I choose to believe it anyways. I like your story better. I also choose to believe it, and I will tell it to everybody I know for the next decade. The old Japanese people who volunteered to clean up nuclear waste sites from the World War II bombings. They knew that they likely wouldn't live long enough to suffer the worst of the effects of radiation, so they did it to protect younger people from experiencing it and to clean up Japan for future generations. It's really heartwarming. They did the same thing after Fukushima. I'm old and will die before the radioactivity kills me, so I will go rescue them. It's great that they did that. Especially because after I read this question I immediately thought of the firefighters in Chernobyl. They went into the reactor to prevent the disaster from escalating further, saving lives. They probably didn't know their heroic act would cut their life short. The Cassini family map, a first-of-its-kind map of France. It took 4 generations of family members and 6 decades to complete. Imagine being that second family member. Your whole life your father works on this map, only for you to work your whole life on it while raising your son to do the same, and it takes a whole nother life for it to be completed. Imagine being that second family member. Your whole life your father works on this map, only for you to work your whole life on it while raising your son to do the same, and it takes a whole nother life for it to be completed. Reminds me of Cologne Cathedral that took 600 years to build. Admittedly, they took a 300-year lunch break in the middle, with a crane being parked on top of the building for 400 years. Imagine your family going 20 generations and not seeing the start or the end of the project. Imagine being the first generation to go back and finding initials carved into the wood for a family member you'll never knew existed. This inscription is hundreds of years old. Ingrid is my great-great-great-great-grandmother. It says for a good time, write a letter to Ingrid'. The giant cathedrals in Europe like Notre Dame would take over 100 years to build. So the person who started building it would work their whole life on it and know they wouldn't be alive to see it complete. I have recently been to Cologne's cathedral. They started building it in 1248, they stopped unfinished in 1560, then halfway through the 1800s they started building it again, finishing it in 1880. Not only the original builders would not see it finished, but neither would their grandchildren. The huge cathedral in Florence took more than 180 years to build. It was sitting there without the final biggest dome for like 30 years because they couldn't figure out how to make the hexagonal dome stable enough to support itself. So the guy that started it didn't even intend to see it finished, but he also gave the younglings a challenge to complete in a better time. Next time I hand over my shitty half-finished code at work, reflect on the cathedral in Florence, little one. Remember the Duomo. Roosevelt in national parks. If he never did what he did, there wouldn't be any today. Corporate greed would have wiped it all out. Even on a smaller scale, people who had the foresight when suburban expansion was happening to set aside some land. I live in an NYC suburb and my town is blessed with a huge, relative to the town size, public park that has a public pool, a lake for swimming and fishing, a freshwater spring, hiking trails, picnic areas, open fields and athletic fields. It is open not only to the residents of the town, but to surrounding towns as well. It is a gem that benefits all the area residents. We have this only because one man, just one man, saw the need to preserve open space in the face of suburban sprawl in the late 60s, early 70s. He donated some of his own land, and then appealed to the state and federal governments to purchase the adjacent plots to preserve the land for future generations. He was successful and the park is named after him. Had he not done that, that land would have just been another 10 single-family home subdivisions by the time the 80s rolled around. My kids, not even born until 30+ years later, have enjoyed this park their entire lives. Edit, lots of great guesses, none correct though, and I'm gonna keep you guessing. It warms my heart to know that other awesome people took this same initiative in different areas. In a very literal sense, the landscape gardens of Capability Brown. He carefully crafted these gardens, directing the planting of trees and bushes to create a beautiful vista, where it would take decades for the plants to actually grow to fulfill his vision. Bloody stupid Johnson. Nah, this'd be a Johnson if the gardens actually grew into a Hunger Games style death trap and obstacle course complete with automated blade arms intended for pruning the topiaries. William Wilberforce. He campaigned in the British government for over 40 years to stop and prevent slavery. He was successful in abolishing the trading of slaves throughout the empire with the Slave Trade Act of 1807 and then the ownership of slaves altogether with the Slavery Abolition Act 1833. He died 3 days after hearing the Abolition Act had passed in Parliament, after a lifetime of campaigning for it. He is buried in Westminster Abbey, which is reserved for monarchs and national figures of significance. His campaign for abolition was the blueprint that other abolitionists like Lincoln soon followed up with. There are many generations living because of this man's choices. Edit, and if his good karma wasn't already high enough, he was also a founding member of the Royal Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, RSPCA. I, 37, came across Wilberforce's biography as a 21-year-old. I don't think any other biography had a greater impression on me than his. At 25 I took my little sister on a little tour through Western Europe. I'm Canadian, BTW, and one of our first stops was Westminster Abbey. Yeah, that was definitely a very special moment in my life, finally meeting the man I admired possibly more than anyone in history. Great comment, you killing joke 96. Cheers to you. The Civil Rights Movement. MLK knew he wouldn't be alive to see integration. True. It's clear he knew this and nonetheless persisted. The day before he was assassinated, he gave his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech and said, "But I want you to know tonight, that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. So I'm happy, tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." Twitter.com. It blows my mind how he knew. It's the most powerful speech I've ever seen. The amount of emotion conveyed in his words hits me every time I see it. I don't believe in a God, but he really makes me believe he saw that promised land, makes me believe we can get there as a people, if not as individuals. I just visited the museum at the hotel where he was shot. If you read anything about the civil rights movement or just being black in the South back then, it's pretty ducking obvious that everyone in that movement was walking around with a target on their back all the damn time. The number of beatings and murders the civil rights movement were subjected to is just mind-blowing, and there's so many more that are lost to history, were never reported.